The rain hammered against the kitchen windows that night, streaking the glass in thin silver lines as Sarah pointed her wineglass at me like it was a gavel. The overhead lights cast a warm glow across the dining table, but the air felt cold, almost metallic, as she leaned back in her chair and said with that soft, razor-edged laugh, "Evan, you've got to stop pretending you're some kind of entrepreneur." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. The hum of the dishwasher in the background suddenly felt too loud, too present. Dad nodded at her words, slow and certain, as if she had spoken a universal truth, while Mom covered her smile with her napkin, pretending it wasn't really laughter. I could feel every eye at that table slide toward me, waiting for my reaction, waiting for the quiet kid to look embarrassed. And when the laughter rose, gentle but cutting, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, just a quiet click, like a lock sliding into place. I remember the taste of oversweetened iced tea on my tongue, the scent of rosemary chicken in the air, and Sarah's voice echoing louder than everything else. Real business isn't something you learn playing around with computers. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Evan Johnson. I'm 28 years old, and until recently, my family saw me as the kid who never grew out of tinkering with wires in the garage. I live in a small apartment on the north side of Columbus, Ohio. Nothing fancy, just a quiet street where you can hear the wind move through the trees at night and the radiator creak when the temperature drops. My days were spent behind a pair of monitors, building systems most people never see, solving problems most people never know exist. It was quiet work, deliberate work, the kind that requires patience and a mind that doesn't mind the hum of servers at 2 a.m. And honestly, the quiet suited me. Growing up, though, quiet wasn't really something people valued in my house. Sarah filled every room she walked into. Her voice, her confidence, even the sound of her heels on the hardwood floor felt like it demanded applause. I remember the way Dad's eyes lit up whenever she talked about business case competitions or the next internship at some big firm. Even as a teenager, she had this polished way of speaking like she was already auditioning for a corner office. Meanwhile, I was in the garage soldering circuit boards under the smell of motor oil and old paint, losing track of hours because a line of code refused to behave. Mom used to stand in the doorway during those afternoons, her arms folded loosely, watching me with that half-puzzled, half-tired expression. "It's good to have hobbies," she'd say, her voice light, but never warm, never proud. "But don't forget, Sarah's building a real future." There was always a pause after that, a small one, but long enough to let the silence say the rest. Family dinners were where the imbalance became most obvious. Sarah would slide into her chair and start talking before I'd even had a chance to unfold my napkin. The smell of garlic bread or grilled steak would drift through the room, the clinking of plates, a soft rhythm beneath her stories. She talked about professors who knew venture capitalists by first name, about projects that required 3-figure IQs and 5-figure budgets. And my parents would lean in, nodding, soaking up every syllable as though she was unraveling secrets of the universe. If I mentioned landing a new client or finishing a complicated software build, the conversation shifted almost instantly. A polite nod from Mom, a distant "that's nice" from Dad, and the moment evaporated like steam off a kettle. Then someone, usually Sarah, would redirect us back to her next big pitch or her next competition. It was subtle, never cruel, but it carried a weight I felt every time I sat at that table. A quiet message that her future mattered, and mine was a placeholder, something they assumed I'd grow out of. Over time, I learned to keep my voice low during those dinners, to let the scrape of my knife on the plate fill the space where my thoughts used to go. And they never noticed the way my fingers tapped nervously under the table, or how I'd stare a little too long at the candlelight reflecting off the silverware, wondering if silence could bruise. The first real fracture, the moment I realized something inside me was starting to shift, happened during one of those evenings. Sarah had just come home from New York, fresh from some leadership summit, her suitcase still sitting by the front door. I remember the smell of rain on her coat when she shrugged it off, tossing it across the back of a chair like she was dropping a trophy. She announced her new startup idea before she even took a sip of the hot tea Mom set in front of her. And that night, as she stood under the ceiling light explaining her plan, her voice strong, her gestures sweeping through the air, she didn't just talk about her dream. She used mine as a cautionary tale. "I mean, look at Evan," she said, smiling sweetly, as if it were harmless. "He knows computers better than anyone I've ever met, but even he admits he needs someone like me to understand how the business world works." The room went quiet in a way that felt heavy against my skin. The air smelled like baked lasagna cooling on the stove, but all I could taste was bitterness. Dad gave a sympathetic chuckle. Mom squeezed Sarah's hand, and I just sat there, my jaw tight, my fingers pressing into the wood of my chair until my knuckles whitened. That was the first time I felt a small crack form. The first time I realized the hurt wasn't going to pass the way it used to. I didn't know it then, but that evening was the beginning of the unraveling, the first tremor before the earthquake that would come years later on that rainy night when Sarah finally crossed a line she didn't even see. The gym lights flickered overhead the night it happened, their hum echoing across the polished floor. I was 11, standing on the sideline of my middle school basketball game, my sneakers damp from the cold drizzle outside. The team had just won, and the air smelled of sweat and orange sliced sugar as everyone crowded around Sarah, who'd made a surprise visit after her debate team sweep. She stood in her pressed blazer cheeks, flushed from the winter air, soaking up praise that wasn't even meant for her. Coach tried to congratulate me for the last-minute assist that sealed the game, but Dad gently steered him away with a hand on his arm. "You should hear about what Sarah accomplished today," he said, his voice warm with pride. I watched Coach's smile shift toward her, watched the circle widen to pull her in and push me out. The echo of bouncing basketballs faded under the sound of applause she didn't even earn that night. My hands felt cold against the plastic water bottle I was gripping, the condensation slick under my fingers as Mom knelt to zip Sarah's coat while barely glancing at me. Even now, the memory returns with the smell of gym varnish and stale popcorn. I didn't understand it then, but looking back, that moment wasn't an exception. It was a blueprint. The truth is, the hurt had been growing quietly for years before Sarah ever told me to stop pretending to be an entrepreneur. It settled into the corners of my life, the way dust settles in forgotten places, slowly, gently, but thick enough to dull everything underneath. When I was a kid, small things always seemed to fall in her direction. Christmas mornings come back to me most vividly, the scent of pine from the tree, the twinkle of colored lights reflecting off wrapping paper, the soft warmth of the fireplace. I remember sitting cross-legged on the carpet one year, the fibers prickling my skin, watching Sarah unwrap a brand new laptop for her schoolwork. The kind with a thin silver frame and a screen that glowed like it held the whole world inside it. My gift came next, a beginner's electronics kit from the clearance aisle, the kind they sold near the seasonal decorations. Mom had beamed as she handed it to me. "Thought this would keep you busy," she'd said, her voice absent, already turned back towards Sarah, who was turning her laptop over in her hands like a crown. I had loved that kit, loved the way the metal pieces felt cool on my palms. But even as a child, I understood something then that I couldn't quite name. My path was something to make do with. Hers was something to invest in. Birthdays weren't much different. At her parties, Dad filmed every moment, the red light of the camcorder blinking steadily as she made speeches and cut cakes beneath bright kitchen lights. At mine, the batteries always seemed to be dead or the tapes full. "We'll record next year," Mom would say, brushing my hair back, as if the gentle touch made up for the missing memories. But next year never came. Even school nights carried that quiet division. I'd be at the kitchen table, the wood cool beneath my elbows, working through math problems while Sarah rehearsed debate speeches across from me. Her voice carried firm, confident, rhythmic, and every so often, Dad would pause his dishwashing to say, "That's what leadership sounds like." He didn't mean it to cut. He didn't realize it did, but the message landed all the same. I learned to shrink the sound of my pencil on paper, as if being too noticeable might interrupt something more important. By the time we reached high school, the air in our house felt calibrated around her. Even her footsteps down the hallway seemed to command more space, more attention. When she applied to Harvard, the tension in the house changed almost like humidity before a storm. Her essays were printed off on thick ivory paper, the kind that smelled faintly like old libraries. Mom kept them stacked neatly in a leather folder, and Dad called in favors from every contact he had. When my acceptance letter came from a state university, I remember the rustling of the envelope sounding embarrassingly thin. The sunlight through the window that afternoon felt too bright, almost harsh, as if it illuminated the truth we all already knew. Mom hugged me, but her eyes were already drifting back to the stack of Sarah's application materials spread across the dining table. "It's a good start," she murmured, smoothing my hair in a distracted gesture. It wasn't just favoritism. It was a belief system, one built so slowly that even I began to accept it. I'd grown up internalizing the roles we'd all been assigned. Sarah was the achiever, the leader, the one destined for something grand. I was the quiet one, the tech kid, the safe bet for never causing trouble. I told myself I preferred it that way, that blending into the background was a choice. But sometimes lying awake at night, staring at the faint glow of my alarm clock, I wondered whether it was actually a choice or a role I'd been trained into. College deepened the divide. I'd visit home for Thanksgiving boots, carrying bits of slush onto the entryway tiles, and Sarah would arrive moments later, sweeping in with her tailored coat and polished boots that clicked confidently across the hardwood. She'd describe networking mixers in rooms that smelled of cologne and catered appetizers. Dad would lean in, asking questions about future internships and connections. When the conversation shifted to me briefly, it felt like a courtesy, like a pause in the main broadcast. "How's school?" Dad would ask, even though he'd never once asked to see my projects. I'd open my mouth to answer, but before I could finish, Sarah would jump in with, "Oh, that reminds me. Did I tell you who I met last week?" And like iron filings to a magnet, all eyes went to her. I learned not to fight it. I learned to swallow the discomfort quietly, letting it dissolve somewhere inside where no one could see it. After college, when I started my consultancy, the pattern didn't change. I worked late nights in my small apartment, the radiator rattling in the corner as winter wind whistled through thin window panes. The glow of my dual monitors became the light I lived by. Coffee cooled too quickly in the mug beside me, and the steady tapping of keys became my closest companion. Meanwhile, Sarah's startup launch was announced on local news stations, her smile filling the television screen at my parents' house. Mom said she looked like she belonged there, framed by stage lights and applause. When I came home for dinner around that time, there was a moment, a small, almost invisible one, that settled into me like a stone. I'd mentioned I'd landed a new contract with a Fortune 500 company. My hands still smelled faintly of the cold air from outside, and I could hear the soft buzz of the overhead light as I spoke. Mom didn't even look up from her phone. "That's good, honey." Her voice was the exact tone someone uses when acknowledging weather. Then she turned to Sarah. "Tell us again about the pitch meeting," she said, her eyes brightening. I'm not sure anyone noticed how I'd stopped chewing for a moment, how I'd lowered my fork back to the plate with a soft clink, how the taste of mashed potatoes suddenly felt bland, almost chalky. It was a tiny pause, a heartbeat's worth of disappointment. But it left behind a sting I carried longer than I should have. The years blurred into a consistent pattern, Sarah rising, shining, leading, and me working in the shadows, building something real, but invisible. And maybe the worst part, was how natural it all felt. How normal. How expected. Our parents didn't mean harm. They weren't cruel. They simply loved loudly in her direction and quietly in mine. And I had grown so used to the soft version of neglect, the kind that doesn't bruise skin, but bruises belief, that I didn't question it anymore. But silence has a way of stacking up. And mine had been building like sediment layer upon layer, until it became something heavier than I knew how to carry. All of it, the gym nights, the holidays, the overlooked achievements, the quiet meals built the foundation for the moment when everything finally cracked. And that moment came years later, on a night when the air smelled like rain and the world felt tilted just slightly, as if warning me that something was about to shift. Back then, I didn't know what the shift would reveal, or just how deeply the truth had been buried under years of quiet hurt. But it was coming. Something in the present was already unraveling inch by inch, pulling the past up with it, like roots being torn from the ground. The glow from my monitor cast a pale blue across the room the night I found it. The apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the heater pushing warm air into the corners and the clicking of raindrops against the window pane. On my screen, buried among spreadsheets and quarterly reports, a single-line item caught my eye. It shouldn't have been there, a capital allocation request signed not by Sarah, but by a senior manager I'd never seen her mention. I clicked it open, and the document expanded its pages, unfolding one after another under the faint buzz of the desk lamp. Numbers spilled out, overextended budgets, missed targets, and a personal expense report that didn't match any company policy. My breathing grew shallow as I scrolled further, my finger trembling slightly on the mouse. And then I saw her signature, bold, sure, confident, sitting at the bottom of a statement that contradicted every rosy picture she'd painted for us. The room suddenly felt too warm, too tight, as though the walls had leaned in closer to hear what I was about to learn. Even now, I can still feel the weight of that moment, the shock settling into my ribs like a stone dropped into deep water. It wasn't that I expected perfection from Sarah. It wasn't even that I expected honesty. But seeing the truth laid out so plainly in numbers and signatures and timelines felt like discovering a second story beneath the one I'd been living in for years, a story I'd never been meant to see. What I found first was simple enough. The company wasn't just struggling. It was drowning. The burn rate wasn't a slow leak. It was a hole punched straight through the bottom of a boat, water rushing in faster than anyone could bail it out. The quarterly projections Sarah had bragged about over dinners had been smoothed, softened, polished to a shine so bright you couldn't see the rot underneath. A chill crept across my forearms as I scrolled the glow of the monitor flickering across lines of red flag alerts. I clicked through documents I'd been too polite to open before, financial summaries, hiring approvals, partnership correspondence, and found trails of decisions that made no sense. Overstaffing, unvetted contracts, product timelines slipping like sand through fingers. Notes from advisors I'd hired in secret, each written with a polite concern that read like someone whispering bad news in a church. And then I saw the emails. They weren't dramatic. No confessions, no smoking gun. But between the lines, the truth was unmistakable. There were messages from Sarah to her leadership team, her tone clipped, impatient, dismissive of feedback. There were threads where she'd ignored direct warnings from my investment representatives, the people she still thought were strangers, brushing off their concerns with confident assurances that growth would catch up eventually. But the one that hollowed me out was an exchange she'd written late one night, time-stamped at 2:14 a.m. The air in my apartment felt colder as I read it, the muffled sound of the rain on the window fading behind my pulse. She had written, "If these investors can't handle volatility, they're not sophisticated enough to understand what we're building." Sophisticated enough? Those were the words she used. the same words she'd thrown at me across dinner tables and holiday gatherings. My chair creaked as I leaned back, the fabric rough against my palms. I couldn't tell if the warmth gathering behind my eyes was anger or something older, something sadder, the slow realization that she had been lying even to herself, building a world where she was the hero and everyone else, the audience. I opened another document, a board presentation draft. The air smelled faintly of the coffee I'd forgotten on my desk hours earlier, now cold and bitter. The slides showed projections so inflated they bordered on fantasy. Comparing them to actual performance was like placing a flashlight against a sheet of paper. Everything false shone right through. I didn't know how long I sat there, the room around me losing shape as the truth sharpened. Every click brought a new piece of evidence, another fracture line spreading across the story I thought I knew. And in that growing silence, something strange happened. For the first time in years, I saw Sarah not through the lens of admiration or envy or childhood roles, but clearly. Unfiltered, unglorified. She wasn't malicious. She was drowning, and she was pulling everyone with her. The betrayal wasn't that she was failing. It was that she'd hidden it behind the same certainty she used to diminish me. She'd woven a story so tight, so confidently told, that even I, the one holding her financial strings, had been lulled into believing the performance would eventually match the promise. But buried in those files was the truth: the company needed another massive infusion of capital. Soon, and without it, everything would collapse. For a moment, the heater kicked on again, blowing warm air across my legs. It didn't chase away the cold settling inside me. All this time, she'd been treating me like the child soldering circuit boards in the garage, the amateur, the one who didn't understand real business, real investors, real stakes. And yet every major decision she'd made had been propped up by money I'd earned, systems I'd built, and expertise I'd lived. I scrolled back to the signature lines, the ones with her name etched in blue. They glowed in the monitor's light like evidence under a forensic lamp. I closed my eyes for a moment, pressing my fingertips against my eyelids, feeling the warmth of my own breath in the quiet room. The heater shut off, leaving a soft hum in its wake, a hum that suddenly felt like the only sound in the world. And then, in the absence of noise, something inside me shifted. The years of swallowing my worth, the years of letting her voice be the loudest, the years of being the quiet shadow behind her spotlight. All of it began to loosen. When I opened my eyes again, the documents were still there, waiting. But I wasn't the same person who had opened them. I went through every line after that with the precision of someone tightening bolts on a fragile structure, slow, steady, intentional. I reviewed cash flow timelines, investor communications, partnership agreements that had fallen through because of unreasonable demands. I read notes from my own advisors, each growing more cautious as the months passed. The truth wove itself together like a net pulled from deep water, heavy with what had been caught. This wasn't just mismanagement. It was denial. And it had been happening for far longer than I'd realized. The hardest part was understanding my own role in it, how my silence had enabled hers. Every time I'd nodded politely at her speeches, every time I'd let her dismiss me, every time I'd allowed the family to believe I was the one playing pretend, I'd reinforced her illusion. My success had protected her from consequences. My anonymity had shielded her from reality. My silence had made her bolder. The rain outside eased into a soft patter, and the apartment dimmed as the hour grew late. I could smell the faint trace of dust warming on the lamp bulb above me, a smell I'd come to associate with long nights and hard truths. Somewhere in that quiet clarity settled over me like a slow breath. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was mine, and it was time to act. I clicked into a blank email draft, my cursor blinking steadily in the corner, a small, insistent heartbeat. The room felt still like the pause before a storm breaks open. I typed the first few words to David Harper, my advisor at Goldman Sachs, my fingers steady now. The decision was already made. And in that moment, that quiet, rain-soaked hour, I felt the beginning of something sharp and new rising inside me, something forged from every slight I'd swallowed and every truth I'd finally allowed myself to see. It was resolve, and it was leading me straight toward the confrontation I'd been avoiding my entire life. The room went dead silent the moment I pushed my chair back from the dining table. The legs scraped against the hardwood with a sharp sigh, cutting through the murmur of voices. Rain tapped steadily against the living room windows, the soft percussion filling the quiet, as I reached into my jacket and set a thick manila folder on the table. Sarah froze mid-sentence, her fork suspended over her plate, steam rising from the roast chicken beneath it. Dad's hand paused halfway to his glass, the amber bourbon catching the warm glow of the chandelier. Mom looked from me to the folder with a stiff, uneasy smile that faltered as soon as she saw my face. And when I placed my phone next to the folder and hit speaker, David Harper's voice filled the room. Calm, precise, unmistakable. "Evan," he said, "whenever you're ready, I can confirm your controlling interest." It felt like the air itself held its breath. But to understand how we reached this moment, I need to walk you back just a little to the steps that made this confrontation not only necessary, but inevitable. I had spent the night before preparing, pacing my apartment, while the radiator clattered and winter wind pressed against the windows. The folder I carried tonight held printed reports, contracts, emails, and signatures, every thread of truth woven carefully together. I kept running my thumb along the edge of the stack, the paper cool and sharp. I knew there would never be a perfect moment to do this. But the family dinner Mom insisted on, the one meant to support Sarah through her business crisis, was the one night everyone would be together and unable to look away. I'd arrived early and sat quietly as Sarah recited a polished version of the company's troubles, her voice steady but brittle at the edges. She was dressed in a fitted navy blouse, her makeup flawless, her posture straight, the portrait of a founder weathering adversity. She blamed the investors for lacking vision. She blamed the economy. She blamed the market. And every few minutes, she cut her eyes toward me with that familiar mix of pity and superiority. I waited, listened, let the room fill with her narrative, until she said it, the line that locked everything into place. "This business needs real investors," she insisted. "People who understand how high-level companies operate. We can't rely on amateurs who play with code and pretend it makes them entrepreneurs." Dad hummed in agreement. Mom sighed like the weight of the world sat on Sarah's shoulders alone. That was my cue. So when the moment arrived, when the words settled like dust in the still air, I stood. And the real story began. I lifted the folder and slid it across the table, the paper whispering against the wood. I think I said, keeping my voice low, steady, "There's something you all need to see." Dad frowned, his brow creasing. "Evan, this isn't—" "It is," I answered softly, "and it's long overdue." Sarah let out a breathy, incredulous laugh. The sound felt sharp in the dimly lit dining room. "What could you possibly have in there?" I tapped the folder. "Everything your investors have been seeing for the last 2 years." She opened her mouth to retort, but David's voice came through the speaker again. "Evan, I can clarify any details the family needs." The room stilled. Mom's hand tightened around her napkin. "Evan, why is your advisor?" "Because," I replied, sliding the top sheet towards Sarah. "I'm the one he represents." Her eyes flicked to the page. She read the heading, Primary Capital Allocation, Meridian Holdings, Beneficial Owner. Evan Johnson, and her face went pale. Her lips parted, but no sound came out, just a quiet, trembling breath. Dad leaned forward, squinting. What am I looking at? I turned the next page over. The structure, Sarah thought, belonged to an institutional fund. It's my holding vehicle. I've been the controlling investor since her Series A funding. Silence. Thick, unnerving. The antique clock against the wall ticked once. Twice. Then Sarah pushed back from the table so hard her chair legs screeched. That's impossible. You can confirm with David, I said. On speaker, David replied calmly. Mr. Johnson has maintained majority ownership since the initial funding round. All board decisions and strategic approvals were routed through my office on his behalf. Mom pressed a hand to her mouth. Dad blinked repeatedly as if trying to clear static from inside his own thoughts. And then something inside Sarah seemed to snap, a brittle edge breaking under pressure. You're telling me, she said, her voice cracking, that you have been the investor calling the shots? That I've been taking advice from your representatives thinking they were industry experts? They are industry experts, I answered. They just happen to be mine. The room rustled with a collective breath. But this wasn't the reveal. Not the real one. Not the one that would flip the room on its axis. That twist came when I opened the second section of the folder. A stack of documents I hadn't planned to bring until the night before, when I discovered something that changed everything. I turned the first page towards Sarah. There's something else we need to discuss. There was a flicker of confusion across her face. Then fear. These, I continued, are reimbursement requests you submitted over the last 18 months for consulting fees. I tapped the header. To a company called Pine River Innovations. Her brows tightened. So, every founder hires consultants? I met her eyes. Sure, except this one doesn't exist. Her breath hitched. I laid out the next page, a bank statement. Then another. The room leaned in. Dad frowned. What is this? I turned the document so everyone could see. Pine River Innovations is a shell account. The payments Sarah submitted, nearly $300,000, were routed to a checking account under her name. I paused. Her personal name. A soft clatter came from Mom's hand, her fork slipping onto the plate. Sarah's voice rose, thin and panicked. That's not... You don't understand. That wasn't... It was... I said gently but firmly. The invoices were fabricated, the signatures mismatched. And the funding? It came directly from the investment I provided. A stunned whisper moved across the table like a breeze. Dad's jaw tensed. His voice dropped low and shaken. Sarah, tell me he's wrong. She swallowed hard. I was going to pay it back. She looked around frantically, her voice breaking. The pressure, the optics, everyone expected me to live a certain way. The words dissolved into the warm, heavy air. I didn't push. I didn't raise my voice. I just let the truth rest where it needed to be. Because everyone finally saw it, the full picture. Not just mismanagement, not just pride, but deception. A deception that had drained company funds. A deception that had been buried in budgets and buzzwords. A deception paid for with the money she told everyone I would never understand. Dad's face collapsed into disbelief. Mom's eyes glistened, tears held back by sheer force of will, and the air in that dining room shifted slowly, unmistakably away from her and toward me. Sarah reached for the papers with a shaking hand. I didn't mean, Evan, I didn't mean... I know, I said, softly. But meaning doesn't erase the truth. She froze her hand halfway across the table, fingers trembling as though brushing against heat. The room had changed. The balance had changed. The script we'd lived under for years, rewritten in a single night. Dad exhaled a long, weary sound. Son, why didn't you tell us? I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the years in my chest. Because I wanted to see if respect could exist without money behind it. No one responded. No one could. I gathered the papers, slid them back into the folder, and stood. The hardwood felt cool under my feet as I stepped away from the table. Behind me, the room remained frozen forks, untouched, glasses sweating onto coasters, the air thick with the shock of truths they hadn't expected to hear. I reached for my coat, and as I walked toward the doorway, the silence behind me was deeper than anything I'd ever heard in that house, the kind that settles only when illusions finally fall. I didn't turn back. I stepped out into the night with the folder still warm in my hand, the door closing behind me with a soft click that felt strangely final. The porch light washed everything in a pale glow, catching the thin mist rising from the wet lawn. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and sharp, the kind that makes each breath feel like a clean start. I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me, listening to the faint hum of traffic in the distance. For the first time in years, my shoulders didn't feel heavy. The house behind me, its windows glowing gold, felt smaller somehow, as if the weight it had held over me had lifted at last. Something in the world had shifted, and I could feel it in the stillness of the night air. That silence followed me to my car, sitting beside me like an old friend I'd forgotten I had. And in that quiet, I understood that the real part of the journey was only beginning. The next morning, sunlight spilled through my apartment blinds in thin, warm stripes, settling across the hardwood like soft brushstrokes. Dust motes drifted in the glow, turning slowly as though the room were breathing with me. I sat on the edge of my bed, the memory of last night still alive in my chest, but without the sting. What I felt instead was a calm I hadn't known I needed, the kind that comes after telling the truth you've carried too long. Over the next few days, I reclaimed the parts of my life I'd quietly handed away. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It began with small actions like cleaning the clutter on my desk and repainting the spare room in a soft gray that reminded me of river stones. The scent of fresh paint hung in the air for days, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. With every brushstroke, I felt something inside settling back into place, a quiet restoration I didn't need anyone to witness. At the company, I initiated the restructuring I'd delayed out of respect for Sarah. I replaced failing systems, clarified leadership roles, and ensured the financial holes she'd created were sealed. The work was intricate, steady, and strangely healing. It felt like stitching something torn, one careful seam at a time. And though Sarah kept her position under the new structure, it was at a level where she could learn without drowning. I allowed myself distance from my parents, too. Not a dramatic cutoff, not anger, just a space where I could breathe without their assumptions pressing in. When Mom called the week after the confrontation, her voice was soft, hesitant, edged with guilt. I listened. I answered kindly, but I kept the conversation brief. "I'm okay," I told her. "I just need a little time." She understood more in that sentence than she had in years. Dad reached out next, a text asking if I had time for coffee. I didn't answer right away. I sat with it, letting the phone rest warm in my hand, the screen dimming slowly. Eventually, I replied with a simple, "Not yet." Boundaries didn't need to be walls. Sometimes they were just doors that stayed closed until you were ready to open them again. In that quiet space, other people stepped in naturally without expectation or history. A colleague I'd known for years invited me to join a small team of consultants working on a problem no one else had been able to crack. We met on Friday evenings in his home office, the scent of cedarwood from his old books drifting through the room. Those hours felt easy, grounding a reminder that I belonged in rooms where my mind, not my silence, was the focus. My neighbor, Mrs. Hughes, who'd lived on the third floor since the building went up, knocked on my door one afternoon with a plate of fresh banana bread. "Heard you working late again?" she said with a gentle smile. "Take a break and enjoy something warm." The kitchen filled with the sweet, comforting smell as I sliced into it, the warmth spreading through me in a way that felt deeper than food. None of these moments were grand. They were small, subtle connections, the kind that remind you that family doesn't always mean blood, and peace doesn't always come from understanding. Sometimes it comes from being seen without needing to explain yourself. By early spring, the company had stabilized. The new team I brought in worked with precision and with guidance. Sarah slowly found her footing in a role that matched her strengths. She kept her distance at first, but eventually she knocked on my office door one quiet afternoon. The hallway still with the faint hum of air conditioning. Her voice was low when she stepped inside. "I'm sorry," she said. Not dramatic, not performative, just honest. The way she looked at me, the way her shoulders lowered, the way her breath steadied, told me the apology came from a place of recognition, not shame. I accepted it with a nod, not because I needed it, but because letting her say it meant we could finally move forward without dragging the past behind us. Away from all of it, I began building something new for myself. Not another company, not another investment. Something quieter. Something mine. One cool Saturday morning with the windows open and a soft breeze carrying in the scent of early season magnolia, I brought home a set of woodworking tools I'd been eyeing for years. The garage behind my building was warm with sunlight as I set up a small workbench near the open door. The sound of sandpaper against wood, slow, steady, rhythmic, felt like a meditation. I lost hours shaping a simple piece of oak into a table drawer, sawdust gathering on my forearms, the scent of raw timber grounding me in each moment. It wasn't about the project. It was about creating something that didn't require permission. Something built with my own hands in my own space on my own time. By summer, the room I'd painted had become a small studio lit by natural light through the large window I'd cleaned until the glass sparkled. I placed the oak drawer inside a cabinet I'd refinished myself. It fit perfectly. The kind of perfect you can't buy, only earn. That afternoon, as sunlight warmed the floor beneath my feet, I realized the life I'd always wanted wasn't loud or grand. It was steady. It was mine. And it was enough. Sometimes we rebuild by returning to what we left behind. Other times we rebuild by finally stepping into the space we've held open for ourselves all along. In the end, I learned that respect doesn't come from being louder or larger than the people who overlook you. It comes from knowing your worth so clearly that no one else gets to define it again. And when I look back now, the journey doesn't feel like revenge. It feels like becoming the person I'd been growing toward for years without even knowing it.